The talk today is motivated by a larger question that geomorphologists have been thinking about in recent years, and ecologists to some extent, and this is this question of how landscapes and ecosystems co-evolve. This was cited as one of the grand challenges in Earth surface processes by a report that came out from the National Research Council a couple of years ago. And it's a question that we can think about at a range of scales. Anywhere from the scale of mountain ranges and thinking about the feedbacks between forest, precipitation, climate, erosion, and the width or shape of mountain ranges. At the scale of hill slopes, the relationships between soil formation and soil transport processes and the shape of hill slopes, why we tend to see rounded hill slopes as we see in the lower photo with regular spacing between ridges and valleys. And down to the scale of what we call the critical zone, that upper skin of the Earth's surface, where we have an interaction between vegetation, organisms, soil production, and soil transport on hill slopes. Rivers are a particularly rich area to think about these relationships between life and landscapes. And traditionally, geomorphologists at least have thought about these interactions in kind of this one-way framework, where we have some supply of materials from hill slopes to channels, routing of those materials that creates some set of processes in rivers. Those processes then give rise to a certain channel morphology. Within that sets a physical template for aquatic habitat for a range of organisms that can then give rise to some population. More recently, we've started to recognize that these are, in fact, often multi-directional relationships, not just a top-down, abiotic affecting biotic processes, but many examples of feedback relationships. So the area of thinking about the relationship between riparian vegetation and morphodynamics being the study of the evolution of landforms and how that is affected by flow and sediment transport processes, is a particularly rich one to think about these two-way relationships between organisms and physical processes. And in the talk today, I'll spend just a couple minutes talking about some types of feedbacks in general. Then I'll give a few vignettes from research that I've done on these topics. The first one will be a field study where we've used a set of controlled flood releases on a river in Arizona to look at the coupling between hydrogeomorphology and seedling response. The second of those looks at the same set of issues but in a laboratory flume setting. Then we go back to the field to look mechanistically at some of the forces required to scour seedlings and how that is mediated by both plant morphology and by physical processes. And then at the end, I'll spend just a couple minutes on some future directions of this research. Okay, so we can think about feedbacks at a range of scales. And at a relatively small scale of thinking about the relationship between flow, hydraulics, sediment transport, and plants, we can think about both an above-ground element of those feedbacks, where flow affects some plant, causes some bending, in some cases perhaps breakage or scour. In turn, that plant slows the flow down, creates drag, can induce sediment deposition or perhaps scour in some cases. We can think about a below-ground element of those feedbacks in terms of the effects of those roots, creating cohesion and stabilizing the bars. These are things that we have a pretty good qualitative sort of idea about. There's lots of kind of conceptual pictures like this in the literature. But developing a quantitative framework for understanding these relationships is quite a challenge. We can, in some cases, look at one-way relationships in the field, how perhaps flow affects plants, plants affect flow, but it's difficult to understand kind of the two-way relationships in a way that is transferable between sites, in a way that is useful in models, and in a way that informs things we care about, like river restoration. So those are some of the broad goals of where this research that we're doing tries to go. One well-understood relationship between flow and vegetation is related to the establishment of pioneer woody seedlings. And I'm going to walk you through what we refer to as the recruitment box model. The idea behind this is that there is some relationship between a hydrograph, as might occur with a spring snowmelt flood here, a certain zone of elevation above the base flow channel that is high enough that any seedlings that are deposited will be protected from subsequent scour, but close enough to the channel that they retain moisture so that they can recruit and establish. There's also a window of timing when seeds are released. A beneficial drawdown rate on the falling limb of floods so that seedlings that are deposited up on bars on floods are not left high and dry. And where those come together, we think of this recruitment box, optimal conditions for seedlings to establish. We know less about the flip side, what some of the feedbacks involved in seedling mortality associated with floods are. And I want to introduce a couple of these diagrams to sort of illustrate some of the ideas of feedbacks. So in the upper left there, we have a feedback diagram where we have some perturbation to a system, such as a flood, that may create sediment transport and topographic change that can create new sites on which seedlings can establish and colonize. The presence of those seedlings can in turn cause a hydraulic change and affect subsequent flooding events and topographic changes. Now that can end up being either a positive or a negative feedback. By positive feedback, I refer to something that would actually shift the system to a new state. A negative feedback, one that would maintain more of a stable type of morphology in a channel. So offsetting effects. So down on the diagram here, we can again think about the zone of elevation above the channel in which we have an area where seedlings can establish where they are likely to not get dried out and also not scoured, and can then grow large enough to induce some of these feedback effects in terms of affecting future flow and sediment transport processes. Another feedback that we see on many rivers, especially in the western U.S., is the disturbance or perturbation induced by something like dams, where we actually eliminate floods. When that happens, the disturbance that might cause scouring of vegetation is taken away, so that vegetation can encroach on channels. That vegetation can increase the flow resistance or drag, so that sediment is deposited, channels may become narrower, and then future floods become less effective in terms of being geomorphically or ecologically effective. And that tends to be a positive feedback loop that gives rise to a new type of channel. Stan Shum refers to this as river metamorphosis. And some classic examples of this. On the first one we see is from the Platte River, Nebraska, where we've had a series of dams, reduction of sediment supply, and encroachment of vegetation on the channel that has changed what was formerly approximately a kilometer-wide braided floodplain that was largely vegetation-free to a channel that is been condensed into a few smaller channels and an anastomosing or an anabranching system with vegetated islands that current floods are not going to do anything about. So it's an entirely new kind of geomorphic system. Another example we see on many rivers in the southwest is related to establishment of tamarisk. And we can see the upper photo where we have bars that are essentially bare and free of sediment. In the lower photo from Webb, we see bars that have been colonized by tamarisk and the channel is narrowed. Now, tamarisk is a big actor in these feedbacks on many rivers in the southwestern U.S. And it's a species of concern for many reasons. Tamarisk was introduced from Central Asia for both ornamental and erosion control purposes. And it's been quite effective in terms of erosion control. That process of channel narrowing and stabilizing bars reduces the amount of sediment that moves out of systems. But it's had some unintended consequences, including competition with native species like cottonwood and willow. There is at least some research that suggests that tamarisk uses more water than native species, which means that cities like Las Vegas are quite interested in tamarisk control efforts to create more water availability for humans. And this has given rise to many millions of dollars being spent to control tamarisk. Now we can ask questions about whether those tamarisk control efforts are treating a symptom or a cause. Are there some broader changes to these systems that is causing tamarisk to take advantage of, or is tamarisk the cause? So this leads into the first field study that I'm going to talk about. And this, like I said earlier, is where we take advantage of a series of controlled flood releases to address these two broad questions. When we first set out, we were interested in looking at how weather floods cause differential mortality among the non-native tamarisk or native seedlings in the system we're working in. And part of our motivation is that many of these restoration strategies designed to eliminate tamarisk from rivers involve things like burning, herbiciding, mechanical removal. And we were interested in looking at whether mimicking natural floods could be, in effect, a restoration effort that gave a boost to the native species. There are many examples of the contrary, where changing the flow regimes gave an advantage to the tamarisk. So we wanted to look at whether mimicking natural floods could be a restoration, riparian vegetation restoration measure. This kind of fits into a broader effort to try and understand how whether we can make tweaks to flow releases from dams in ways that achieve downstream ecosystem objectives. Again, something that managers need more quantitative information on. Usually, mimic natural flows is not quite good enough for managers when we're talking about economically valuable water in the desert Southwest. They need to know how much, when, what is needed in terms of achieving some objective. Well, this sort of more limited study gave rise to a larger study over a series of years to try and understand the shifting nature and strength of these feedbacks. And I'll talk more about what I mean by that and what we found. Okay, so our study site is the Bill Williams. It's a river in western Arizona. And it is dammed by Alamo Dam. We've got flow heading to the west, and it goes into Lake Havasu, which is on the California-Arizona border. And this is a unique system in many ways because the dam here does not have hydropower. Many of the sort of political constraints around releasing controlled floods for ecosystem purposes are absent. What we're doing here is analogous in some ways to some of the controlled flood releases in Grand Canyon from Glen Canyon Dam. But the stakes and the funding involved are much lower. Okay, so Alamo Dam was built in the late 60s, and like many dams, it's caused dramatic changes to the flow and sediment regimes. So we can see this graph of annual peak flows. This is a desert river that had occasional extremely large flood events. And the reason the dam was built was to cut off these very large floods. So it's ironic in some ways that we have a dam that's releasing controlled floods, but these controlled floods we're talking about now are much, much smaller than the natural floods. If we look over at the last few events around 2010, those are the controlled floods we're studying. And as we'll see, they are geomorphically effective, but in a scaled down sense. We're working with a much kind of smaller system, smaller amount of the floodplain that's being affected by these events. This is a dam that's also cut off sediment supply from much of the basin. And I'm not going to really get into the sediment supply side of this story because of time, but that's another piece of the puzzle that we're trying to understand in terms of how does reduction of sediment supply affect these feedbacks that we're interested in between physical and vegetation processes. So, like the examples I talked about before on the Platte and the lower Green River, we've seen channel narrowing as a result of encroachment of tamarisk as a result of the reduction of flows. But note, these processes are not just because of dams. There's been a regional shift in climate in many of these areas from a wetter first half of the 20th century, in which we had some of these larger events, to a drier second half of the 20th century. Okay, so here is the series of controlled floods that we've been studying. The first of these is in 2005, and the flow there is the maximum release capacity of the dam. And this is an El Nino year, so they're releasing a lot of water. So in this part of the country, El Nino means a lot of water, La Nina means dry conditions. So this 2005 event was important because this created a clean slate channel. It scoured out bars within the active channel, and it deposited a lot of seedlings that then grew into a cohort of seedlings that we would then study and track in subsequent years. And as we can see in subsequent years, we have a variety of magnitude, duration, drawdown rates, and so on. And for some of these events, there is an actual interaction between the scientists and the managers where we say, we want this flood during our spring break so we can come down and study this as a controlled experiment. And fortunately, spring break tends to coincide with the seed release window of the native species that we're interested in. Okay, so we focused on 2 study reaches and several bars within these study reaches that had a cohort of seedlings established in those 2005 events. These study reaches were selected because they represent differences in the distance from the dam. So they have different flow and sediment transport conditions, somewhat different vegetation conditions. And we've tracked vegetation, hydraulics, topography, and bed sediment size on these reaches over our study period. Okay, so some results. We see that we're first looking at a comparison within our study sites of salix, which is Salix goodingii, which is a Gooding's willow. It's a tree form of willow. So it's not like the shrubby willows that we see, that we're maybe used to seeing on many rivers. It's shrubby at its young stage, but then it grows into a tree, versus tamarisk. And we're looking at the density of those species before and after these flood events. So we see that under all these conditions, the tamarisk outnumber the willow in this river. And this is a common dynamic in rivers in this part of the country. And in fact, in most rivers in this part of the country, the tamarisk are completely dominant. The Bill Williams is of interest in part because it still does have a dynamic native community of vegetation. Another thing we see is we do see this differential mortality. So the floods cause many more tamarisk seedlings to die than willow seedlings. And the numbers are greater in the first year for tamarisk. The second year we essentially see, in 2007, the second of these events that we studied, we essentially see no mortality of the willow, but still many of the tamarisk are being killed off. And essentially this difference is a function of size. These are all seedlings that were established in 2005, but the salix, the willow, grow faster than the tamarisk. So we have floods that are hitting tamarisk that are on the order of average 10 centimeters in height versus willows that are on the order average 40 centimeters in height. So the willows have grown up and become more resistant more quickly than the tamarisk. We see differential mechanisms for this mortality. In our site that's close to the dam, this is one of our bars that we study. Here's our flood in 2006. Post-flood, essentially we just see trimming and scour of these bars. So scour is the mechanism of mortality here. The plants are small, they don't create much feedback effect. The root systems are not well developed. So the plants are scoured relatively easily here. This is our downstream site. And the Bill Williams, like many desert rivers, is a losing system. So by the time flows reach a downstream part of the river, there is less flow strength. Some of the flow may have been lost to groundwater, and there is more sediment supply. It's picking up sediment from large alluvial valleys. And on the top graph, we can see that the post-flood elevation has actually increased in this site on top of our vegetation bar, and the mechanism of mortality is burial of the plants. Now, oftentimes when plants are buried, they can actually sprout back up through the sediment, so we didn't necessarily expect this to stick, but it did. The tamarisk were buried, but the willow are still there. So they were tall enough. So essentially this wiped out the tamarisk because they were small, they got buried. The willow were large enough to survive the burial. And this has then given a competitive advantage moving forward to the willow. So differential geomorphic effects by which mortality occurs. In subsequent years, we started to see the nature of these feedbacks change. So whereas in the first year the plants were relatively small, so did not have a large effect on the flow and sediment transport, those seedlings that did survive that first event grew, as plants do, and they started to have a progressively greater effect on subsequent floods that came through, to the point where we had larger floods towards the end of this study period, and they really didn't do that much geomorphically or in terms of plant mortality. So we've seen a shift in the strength of the feedbacks from early in our study period, when it's essentially a system that's dominated by the physical processes, to a time later in the study period where the plants have grown larger, they've stabilized their bars, they slow the flow down more, so that you would need a progressively larger and larger flood to achieve the same type of effect that you got early in the period. And this is an example of what's been kind of outlined as a biogeomorphic succession process in some papers by Korenblit and others, where systems move through time from what we might call a geomorphic phase that is triggered by something like a large flood event, such as we had at the beginning of our study. It scours things out. The effect of vegetation is relatively small. A period in which there are no flood events and the plants can grow and their strength and effect on physical processes can grow in turn, to this ecologic phase where plants become less sensitive to things like floods until the system is again reset by catastrophic events. Okay, so this is all well and good. One river, a few floods, a couple bars, some nice relationships, but still fairly limited in terms of being able to generalize. So we wanted to take this type of approach to the flume, to ask some of the same questions, but in a more controlled setting, where we could manipulate variables such as the size of plants, the composition of the plants in our flume, and the type of flow and sediment transport effects that those plants are experiencing. To, again, look at the two-way effects. How do floods affect plants? How do plants affect floods and morphology? So one of the challenges in terms of trying to run flume experiments to simulate natural processes is scaling. So we have all kinds of things to think about scaling, such as the plant size, the sediment size, and time. So one of the things we're trying to simulate is this succession of time where we may have an initial flood over a bare bar type system. Plants grow, and the effect of those plants increases. So we can try and scale time in the flume by conducting sequenced flood events that we then put plants of different sizes into the flume to test the relationship between sequencing of floods, sediment supply, and plant morphology. All right. So we do this in an innovative flume setting. There's been a number of kind of small-scale flume studies where people put in things like rigid sticks to try and represent plants and wood dells and so on. But we're using a facility at the St. Anthony Falls Lab, the Outdoor Stream Lab, which is essentially a full-scale experimental facility where we can route large amounts of water and sediment and put in real plants. So we have a meandering channel with an experimental area that has a point bar that we'll be focusing on. And this is a slightly different view of it. It's actually connected to the Mississippi River. So there's the Mississippi in the background. This is in downtown Minneapolis. So this is in an old side channel of the Mississippi where the divert flow of the Mississippi, it goes through our flume and back into the Mississippi. So what we do is we harvest seedlings from our field site, tamarisk and cottonwood. We, with great care, send them to Minnesota. We retain the roots. We try and retain the moisture. And then we put them in buckets in Minnesota and let them acclimate to that new system and let some elements of the root structure regrow. We tried various ways of doing this, stopovers in greenhouses and so on, but this is a system that we found worked. So all of these buckets have different combinations of plants, some with just tamarisk, some with tamarisk and cottonwood. Then we can transplant those buckets onto the point bar of our flume, and these are buckets that we can actually lift the bucket out, so the sediment and the plant with its intact root structure is then left on the bar. So we end up with something like this, where each of these circles represents a bucket, and we can manipulate the plant configuration. Okay? So, full-scale experiment using real plants, combination of tamarisk and cottonwood. So here's our configuration of 8 different runs, and the key here is that we have different densities of plants, different combinations of species. We are using the same flow rate for all of these, but we have some with a high sediment feed rate and some with essentially no sediment feed on the bottom, these ones in purple. Okay. And that's what some of them look like during the floods. The nice thing about a flume setting is we can measure things in a much, much more controlled and detailed way than we can in the field. So not only can we manipulate our variables in different ways than in the field, but also we can measure at a higher resolution. All right, so this is a graph of the topography at the equilibrium state of these runs for these different configurations. And the colder colors are deeper water, so the thaw leg of the channel on the outer edge of the point bar. The warmer colors are higher elevations on the point bar. And we can see that our run 4 here, where we have dense mixed vegetation, has caused the most building up of that point bar. So essentially we're seeing the flow being slowed down by the presence of those plants, trapping of sediment on the point bar, and less of that effect when we either don't have sediment feed, as in the last 3 runs, or when we have different combinations of plants. We can also look at this just based on differencing of elevation from our baseline case. Run 0, our baseline case, is no plants, but still a high sediment feed. And here the bluer colors, the colder colors, are scour, and the warmer colors, the red, is deposition. So we can see more deposition up on the point bar in our runs with our densest vegetation. focus there on the area where our plants are. In the flume, we can also study sediment transport processes in much more detail than in the field. So the flume is meant to simulate a mixed sand-gravel river. So we have sediment transport by movement of dunes. So if you look on that point bar, around the point bar, you can see a series of dunes on the bed. And we can look at sediment transport by looking at different snapshots of bed topography over time. So each of these kind of curved features going across the graph, the yellow and the red, represents a dune. And if we take snapshots of time, we can see these dunes moving through our flume. We try to quantify that sediment transport and how it relates to vegetation by looking at the standard deviation of the bed fluctuations. So we see the greatest standard deviation of bed fluctuations signifying the greatest movement of dunes through the system in our baseline case where we have no vegetation. And vegetation tends to suppress that movement of dunes. Okay, so the more vegetation in the channel, the more kind of sediment transport is slowed down. In our last three runs where we have no sediment feed, sediment transport is also slowed down as well. So in a sense, we can see by doing these configurations that the presence of vegetation is in some ways having the same effect as a reduction of sediment supply into the system in terms of sediment coming out of the system. All right, so this is kind of a summary graph talking about the elevation changes and the sediment transport effects through these different runs. So the top one we see our greatest change in elevation where we have more vegetation. So there we see sediment trapping and steering of the flow out into the thalweg, so more scour. And in the bottom graph, a gradual sort of suppression of the movement of dunes through there as we either create more vegetation drag or as we shut down the sediment feed. Okay. So quickly back to the field and a little closer to home. This last piece of the work is being led by my PhD student, Sharon Bywater-Reyes. And here we're continuing to ask that question of the forces required to scour seedlings, but also to try and look at how that's mediated by both the above ground and below ground effects, size of the plants, the morphology of the plants, and by hydrogeomorphic characteristics like sediment size, depth to groundwater, and topography. So since we're working on the Bitterroot, we don't have the advantage of controlled flood releases. Fortunately, no dams there. So we approach the problem in slightly different ways. And we're working at a place called, a bar along the Bitterroot, a place called MPG Ranch. And this is south of Lolo, north of Florence. And Sharon has extensively quantified the physical features of this bar, installing wells and stage gauges, mapping the textural patches of grain size on the bars, conducting repeat topographic measurements before and after this spring's flood runoff event, and then coupling that with an experiment to pull out plants of different sizes. So what she's doing here is attaching a load cell connected to a data logger and using a winch system. She pulls out the plants, and the load cell and the data logger record the forces steadily building up as you pull the plants out, and then the maximum force at the time the plant either pulls out or breaks. The plants are pulled out in a downstream direction to simulate the direction of force that a flood would create. The sediments are pre-wetted to, again, try and simulate flood conditions. And then after the plants are pulled out, photographs are taken against a clear background to then use an image processing software to try and characterize the architecture of both the above ground part of the plant and the plant roots. So some initial results. This is focused on small plants. Okay? Because one thing that we have found in our previous field study is that the big plants are not susceptible to flood events anymore. They reach this stage where they perhaps are more affected by relationships with other organisms and so on. But in terms of thinking about flood scour on plants, we found from our previous work that there is some threshold of small plants that are susceptible. Okay, so here are the sizes, the height and diameter of what she's looking at, and some preliminary results of the pull-out force versus the height or diameter of the plants. And as you would expect, a positive relationship between height and diameter, but not a clean and neat one. So part of the next step of the work is to try and figure out what we can learn from this scatter. Are there indicators related to the below ground, how well developed the root structure is? That would help explain the scatter. Is it related to where these plants are on the bar and their depth to groundwater, for example, and so on? All right, so these are new results. This is work Sharon's been working on this fall. Okay, so next steps. We've talked about these two field efforts and the flume work. One of the next main steps of this work is to take this into a computational modeling framework. So we'll be using a two-dimensional numerical model to characterize flow and sediment transport processes, and to try and simulate the effects of both hydraulics and sediment supply for a wider range of conditions than when we've been able to study either in the field or in the flume on mortality. We also want to take what we're learning from these tests of pulling out plants, from these flume studies and so on, and use that in the model to better characterize the feedback effect, the drag effect of the plants on the physical processes, which is a big gap in current models right now, is trying to kind of characterize that vegetation effect well. And we'll be applying these to our two field sites, the Bitterroot and the Bill Williams. Another element of future research that kind of grows from this perspective of thinking about life and landscape coevolution is going to be some research that I'm working on with some colleagues here, especially Marco Mineta, to address some of these broad questions of how climate affects ecosystems, and think about how hydrogeomorphic processes of changes in flow regimes, changes in fire, changes in sediment regimes affect the fluxes of water, sediment, wood, nutrients in watersheds at different scales. And we'll do this by coupling models that operate at the watershed scale to models that operate at the reach scale, as I've been talking about here, and then to make the link to different types of biota, whether that's riparian vegetation or fish. And the Bitterroot Basin is the area that we're interested in implementing this coupled modeling approach. And the Bitterroot is rich in many respects, both because of existing research that folks like Marco and Lisa Eby's group are doing in the Bitterroot, and because of the intersection of land use, fire, and things that we care about like fish, economics, farming, tourism, etc. So it's an area that we're going to be focusing on in our IOE research in the coming years. So with that, I'd be happy to take your questions.